afternoon, everyone. You are in for a remarkable experience this afternoon. I want to thank Lynn and the Coalition for the Life Sciences for coordinating this important briefing for us today. Today we're going to talk about the U.S. goose that lays the golden eggs, or at least the U.S. goose that has historically laid golden eggs, and it's laid multiple eggs. That is, good jobs, longer and healthier lives, and lower healthcare spending. And that, of course, I'm referring to is the funding for the National Institute of Health. The funding has declined by some 25% in real dollars over the last 10 years. Now, that is significant in and of itself. But during that time, other things have been happening around the globe. We still lead in terms of patents and in overall research, but China is about to eat our lunch. In fact, it is now eclipsed. Did I do something by just touching this? Sorry. China has just about eclipsed Japan now in terms of research, and within the next 10 years, it is anticipated that they will indeed overcome us in terms of research and development, and that would be indeed a tragic set of circumstances. In the Bay Area, where I represent one of the most innovative places on the planet, we have the University of California, San Francisco, which has been the largest recipient of NIH funding for a public institution, and oftentimes #1 overall. And of course, in my district is the birthplace of the biotechnology industry with the founding of Genentech over 30 years ago. So I'm very excited to introduce a former Genentech executive and a UCSF professor who is our guest speaker today. He's a Rhodes Scholar. Dr. Marc Tessier-Lavigne is president of the Rockefeller University, where he is also the Carson Family Professor and head of the Laboratory of Brain Development and Repair. He's a world leader in the study of brain development and neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. After receiving his undergrad degree from McGill and Oxford Universities and a PhD from University College London, Doctor held faculty positions at the University of California, San Francisco, and at Stanford University, where he was a Susan B. Ford Professor in Humanities and Sciences and an investigator with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. As a former Genentech Executive Vice President, Research, and Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Tessier-Lavigne directed 1,400 scientists in disease research and drug discovery for cancer, immune disorders, infectious disease, and neurodegenerative diseases. His breadth of experience makes him a perfect person to discuss the important and necessary partnership between Congress and the National Institutes of Health and the pharmaceutical industry. To call him a rock star in medicine would not be an exaggeration. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tessier-Lavigne. And I apologize for moving.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman Spear. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here today and to develop the themes that the Congresswoman has introduced. What I'd like to do today is to start by first spending a few minutes talking about the huge need for new therapies, but also the great opportunities that lie before us because of the revolution in biomedical science that's occurred over the past several decades. And then I'll describe how the NIH and NIH funding plays a critical role in enabling these discoveries and indeed in fueling the industry that takes scientific discoveries and turns them into therapies and cures for poorly treated diseases. And I'll close by discussing the challenges to the bioscience ecosystem that result from the contraction of NIH spending, as well as an action plan for the future. But before I do that, I'd like to spend just a minute, if you will, introducing the institution that I have the privilege of representing, Rockefeller University, because I expect that many of you aren't familiar with it. It's a small institution nestled on the Upper East Side of Manhattan with just 70 laboratories, about 1,200 scientists, just focused on biomedical research, just a graduate school. Because we don't have undergraduates, we don't have a football team, so many of you won't have heard of us. But if you're a biomedical researcher, you know about us because it's been arguably one of the most successful, if not the most successful, biomedical research institute in the world by many metrics, including the fact that we've had more Nobel Prizes in medicine or chemistry than any other institution in the world, more than Harvard, more than Stanford, more than MIT, indeed more than just 3 countries. And also, in terms of scientific impact measured by citations, we again rank #1, again ahead of all of those institutions. It's the site of many transformative discoveries, including the fact that genes are made of DNA, probably the most transformative discovery of the 20th century, and many others shown there, as well as medical applications from those discoveries also illustrated. So I bring the perspective of the head of an academic research institute to this, but as Congresswoman Spear also said, I also bring to this discussion my experience from being the chief scientific officer at Genentech, a large biotech company. So let's start where it matters, which is the burden of disease. And we should start by celebrating the advances that have been made over the past 50 years. Heart disease and stroke have been, mortality from heart disease and stroke has been reduced by more than 50% over that period. Many infectious diseases have been tamed. At the same time, there are many areas that remain challenging. Deaths from cancer are just starting to decline. This is accelerating. I'll focus on that in my talk. There are other areas, however, where things seem to be getting worse, not better. The emergence of antibiotic-resistant infectious diseases, and the twin tsunamis of metabolic disease, including obesity and type 2 diabetes on the one hand, and Alzheimer's disease on the other, that threaten to overwhelm our nation and potentially to bankrupt us. And this slide just shows you, reminds you that the 5 million people with Alzheimer's today in the US are projected to climb to about 8 million by 2030 and 13 million by 2050 because of the aging of the population, the biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, of course, being aging. And this will have a huge human toll. Think of the patients who are robbed of their identity, their loved ones, their caretakers. It will also have a huge economic toll. The cost of care for Alzheimer's is projected to rise to $500 billion by 2030 and double again to $1 trillion per year by 2050 if we do not develop medicines that can slow or arrest the disease. And the costs of these other diseases also threaten us in a big way. Now, new therapeutics will be an important part, an essential part of tackling those diseases. Indeed, if we look at life expectancy since the 1950s, which has increased about 10 years, it's been estimated that new therapies are the greatest contributor to that. About half of the contribution in the late 1900s, and more than that, about 3/4 in the 2000s. And indeed, for a disease like Alzheimer's disease, it's very clear that what we need to do is understand the disease better so we can develop therapeutics to tackle it. Now, the good news is that the opportunity for making progress in those areas has never been greater. And I'd like to spend just a minute on this because it's a very important part of the overall thesis here, which I spelled out here, which is that we live in a golden age of biological research, of disease research, and of drug discovery that's been enabled by a revolution in the biosciences that's occurred over the past 40 years, thanks to the development of very powerful technologies, recombinant DNA, which emerged in the 70s, gene sequencing, human genetics, imaging, and others, all of which have made it possible to tackle basic biological mechanisms, our understanding of the body and health, and disease mechanisms in a much more systematic and broad way than was ever possible before. And so we can now tackle disease systematically, and that is enabling systematic drug discovery. And I've illustrated this pictorially below by, as you see this timeline from the 50s through to today, as we see biology becoming more and more mechanistic and molecular, and that understanding then enabling us to tackle disease mechanisms, with the number of plausible mechanisms that are being unearthed by scientists every day increasing, and which we can then interrogate to ask which ones contribute to diseases, which ones are the best entry points for tackling disease. Now, I'd like to give just 2 examples, illustrate how this bioscience revolution is enabling drug discovery, both taken from cancer. And the first is taken from my own experience at Genentech, a drug called Erave that we developed for advanced or metastatic basal cell carcinoma. And the drug works by blocking a biochemical pathway known as the hedgehog pathway. And I think it's very instructive to look at how this all came about. It started in the 1980s when scientists were studying the embryonic development of fruit flies, not because they had any particular interest in fruit flies per se, but because it was possible to study it. It was and the thought was that this was a simpler system where we could learn some of the rules of development that might be applicable to human beings. The scientists discovered a mutant fruit fly whose larvae, and you know that flies are made initially as larvae, as you can see in this dark field view, had this sort of small rotund appearance with bristles, so they called it a hedgehog mutant. And the gene that was interrupted, the hedgehog gene, turns out to be a very important contributor to development of fruit flies. In the 1990s, it was found that the very same gene, or its analog, its homolog in humans, because we have a hedgehog gene as well, plays an equally important part in human embryonic development. And by the mid-90s, it became clear that abnormal activation of this hedgehog biochemical pathway was the cause of a certain number of cancers. This is a theme that's also become clear over the last 2 decades. If you think about an embryo growing from a single egg to a baby over a period of 9 months, that's an explosive growth of tissue, the same kind of explosive growth that you see in cancer, and indeed many cancers are caused by the tumor cells reactivating pathways that were active in embryonic development. The hedgehog pathway is one of them. This motivated some scientists in academia to found a biotech company that initiated drug discovery to try to make drugs to block this pathway. By the mid-90s, that company partnered with Genentech, where I was, to discover what ended up being Erave and to develop the drug with stunning success in the clinic. As you can see here in this scan of a patient with metastatic basal cell carcinoma. This is a cancer, many cases of which are caused by abnormal activation of this pathway. And you can see the tumors in this scan. These are the dark spots here. This patient responded very well to the drug with the tumors melting away, and you can see that at 8 months we see the disappearance of the tumors by interrupting this hedgehog signaling pathway. And data like this led in 2012 to the approval of Erave by the FDA. Now there are 2 things I'd like to point out here. First, the long timelines to develop this, where the basic knowledge develops over a few decades, and then it's tested initially. The idea that it might be a good pathway for drug discovery is tested with various players entering the fray, and then a long clinical development path, as I'll get back to later. And you see this relay race with the academics unearthing the basic knowledge, partnering with industry, and then industry carrying the ball as we go into the clinic. Let me give another example, hot off the presses, which is one of the most promising areas in cancer research today, which is immunotherapy. And 2 weeks ago, many of you will have seen the headlines in the papers because of all the excitement at the annual meeting of the American Society for Clinical Oncology, where some of these data were presented. It's around immunotherapy. It's a very different idea. A drug like Erave hits the tumor directly, so it's a drug that targets the tumor. Immunotherapy is a different concept. The drug doesn't hit the tumor. What it does is stimulate your immune system, the host's immune system, to reject the tumor. This is an idea that had been around for over a century, but people had not been able to get traction until just in 2011, when the first immunotherapy drug that stimulates the immune system for cancer was approved by the FDA, a drug called Erave or ipilimumab. And again, if you look at the timeline to development of Erave, you see a similar pattern. In the 80s and 90s, academic scientists discovered a molecule called CTLA-4 on immune cells. It took a number of years, very difficult work, to figure out that CTLA-4 might be a brake on the immune system, leading to the idea that if you could take away that brake, maybe you could activate the immune system to target the cancer. A controversial idea, but the academics convinced a small company, Medarex, to start exploring this. Encouraging clinical data led them to partner with a larger company, Bristol Myers Squibb, for full clinical development, and ultimately approval by the FDA in 2011. I just want to show you 2 pieces of data to show you the remarkable effects of this drug. First, as you probably know, metastatic melanoma is a horrible disease where until drugs like Erave, the prognosis was very poor, with a median survival well below a year and at 2 or 3 years, very few patients still alive. This is what we see now with 10 years of experience of Yervoy. You see the proportion of patients diagnosed with metastatic melanoma alive over a period of years here, up to 10 years. And you can see that, first of all, survival is extended for all patients, but even more importantly, for a sizable subset of the patients, about 20%, we see very long-term remissions. Remember, by this point, most of the patients would normally be dead. So first of all, a remarkable effect, also raising the question about what about the other 80%, a point I'll come back to later. But let me just show you one example of this. A patient diagnosed in 2001, well, actually diagnosed earlier, but who had progressed on prior standard of care. And you see this large lung mass, a tumor from the melanoma that had metastasized. This patient was treated with Yervoy. The immune system attacked and removed the tumor, and you can see 10 years later, no evidence of disease. This patient is one of the ones at this end of the curve. A remarkable discovery, and really has blown open the field and led to a lot of recognition for the pioneers, particularly Dr. Jim Allison, now at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, who was really one of the people who pushed the idea and who won last year one of the breakthrough prizes. You've probably heard of them, the $3 million prizes set up by Mark Zuckerberg and other tech leaders to celebrate scientists who have made transformative advances. And I'd like to just share with you a clip from the awards ceremony last December where Jim received his award, because it really brings it to life and also shows that he has talents beyond his science.
Well, I'm a king bed baby, buzzing around your hive.
Dr. James Allison, sit back and let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Allison. His business card reads like War and Peace.
I started in academics for selfish reason. That's because you want to be the first person on the planet that knows something, and preferably the first person on the planet that knows something important.
He also is a mean harmonica player. His work was the first to link the power of the immune system to the treatment of inoperable tumors.
What really drove me was to understand how the immune system worked. I really had my eye on the basic biology, but every now and then I put my feet up and say, okay, how do we use this to go after cancer?
It was stage 4 melanoma.
5 years ago, if you got a diagnosis of metastatic melanoma, that was pretty much it.
We fought through months and months of chemo, nothing worked.
There were no therapies that had ever been shown to extend life at all. Many people were trying to mobilize the immune system to attack cancer. It really hadn't ever worked very well. There was general skepticism about any kind of immunotherapy. At the time, it was considered kind of a crazy way of looking at cancer, because the cancer doesn't matter, because we're not treating the cancer. We're treating the immune system. When the drug that I had a lot to do with developing was tested in metastatic melanoma, and almost a quarter of the patients had durable responses, so that the immune system keeps going against the tumor cells. We finally know that the immune system can work. 50% of the patients now have objective responses. Before 2010, there were none, but works for a long time. And now our job is to extend that way beyond melanoma to other tumor types, and also get it up from 50% to as close to 100% as we can get it. One of the most gratifying moments that I had was I met this young woman. It was the first anniversary since she had been declared tumor-free.
If treatment hadn't have worked, I wouldn't be here.
She was so happy. She hugged me, and then everybody started crying. Later, I got the photograph of her first baby. After that, I got another one of her second baby.
Get us in 20 years when they're in college.
That's how we do it.
Well, that was last December, and excitingly, just a few weeks ago at the ASCO meeting, data addressed the two challenges that Dr. Allison set down. First, to extend this to other tumors, and secondly, to increase the long-term remission rate from 25%, with showing that targeting CTLA-4, but also other targets known as PD-1, PD-L1, and others, is showing great efficacy beyond melanoma in lung cancer and renal cancer and head and neck cancer and others, and also strong evidence of combination therapies. And I'll just show you one more piece of data. This is a combination of Yervoy, the drug I showed you previously. You'll recall the long-term remission rate was about 20%. But now in combination with another one of these immune checkpoint inhibitors called nivolumab, also made by Bristol Myers Squibb. And here you see at 2 years that the overall survival rate is at 79%. So exactly in the direction that we want. It's still a small sample size, just 53 patients. We have to see how it develops, but very, very encouraging that tackling the immune system in this way will yield long-term benefits. So I hope that these brief vignettes have convinced you that what we're seeing is that the face of cancer therapy will be revolutionized over the next 10 to 20 years. And it's not just cancer. Other areas too. If you just look at drugs approved over the past decade, you see remarkable advances in treating hepatitis C, multiple sclerosis, cystic fibrosis, and others, autoimmune diseases. It's important at the same time to recognize that the breaking open of each of these fields is not synchronous. So our understanding of cancer is the most advanced, with our understanding of immune disorders and infectious disease hot on its heels. Further behind is our understanding of metabolic disorders. Even further, our understanding of Alzheimer's, a field in which I work, where I think a fair summary is that our understanding of Alzheimer's today is sort of at the level of our understanding of cancer 20 years ago. So we're just starting to break open that field. And for psychiatric disorders, even further behind, and simply because we know very little about the functioning of the brain. And in fact, it's the latter fact, the fact that we don't understand, that led the drug industry to leave psychiatric disease. You all read the headlines 3 or 4 years ago where company after company shut down its research on psychiatric disease. And it's not because there wasn't a great interest. It's not because there wasn't a great need. It's not because there weren't great markets. It's estimated that 35% of the total disease burden in Europe and indeed in the US is due to brain disorders. But, as eloquently stated here, neuroscience is one of the least understood areas of biology, reflecting the fact that the brain is the most complicated organ in the body. And the simple equation is this: no knowledge, no drugs. If you don't understand how the disease arises, you don't know how to tackle it. It's not that industry doesn't want to focus on the diseases, we just don't have the knowledge. And that's why the President's Brain Initiative is so important. As you know, a year ago, it was announced that there was going to be there was a desire to have a focus on the brain. The committee produced its report, again, just 2 weeks ago with an action plan for understanding the brain, based, again, on remarkable technological advances, new tools like optogenetics that have emerged in the last 10 years that now make it possible to map brain circuits, understand how they work, and understand what goes wrong in these diseases. Without that knowledge, we can't make progress. So with that as a backdrop, I'd now like to focus on the vital role that the NIH plays in this entire ecosystem. And for this, I want to drill down a little bit further in the whole pathway of making a drug that's illustrated here. As I think the 2 examples I gave you illustrate, you have to start with scientific discoveries, both of fundamental biological processes and then how they go awry in disease, to identify specific molecular targets that you can target with a drug. Once you have that information, then you try to make a drug substance that targets that molecular target, that by blocking it or activating it will modify the disease. This is done, this is tested first in animals. And then if the drug shows enough efficacy and safety, it's moved into clinical development for testing in humans. And just to add a little bit more color to this, and some of the terms that are often used, in terms of scientific discovery, we refer to it as basic or fundamental research. And what we're trying to do is to understand the normal process, how it goes wrong in disease, and identify specific molecular entry points against which one could make drugs. Then drugs are made against them in a few phases known as lead identification, lead optimization, extensive toxicology in animals to make sure they're safe before they go into humans, and then the traditional phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 stages of clinical development that you're all familiar with, and approval by the FDA. So who does this work? Well, it turns out there's a division of labor between 4 major stakeholders in the ecosystem. Most of the scientific discovery that leads to the insights that are built upon are made in academia, in research labs and research institutes in universities, supported by the NIH. At the other end of the spectrum, industry, mostly large pharmaceutical companies and large biotech companies, are responsible for making the drugs and taking them through human clinical trials. There are 2 other important stakeholders, disease foundations and early-stage biotech companies, which tend to get in at this stage when some insights are starting to come through on the diseases, and they help identify targets, they help start moving them towards the generation of drugs, sometimes even moving them into the clinic, though typically they partner with larger companies because of the huge expense. So that's the ecosystem as we know it. And Given the stresses on the system, which I'll come back to later, which the Congresswoman articulated, you might say, well, couldn't industry play a bigger role in supporting the basic research that's out here? These companies can't, they're cash poor. These companies do have more resources, but the reason they can't go further earlier is because the cost and timelines to drug discovery and development are already too great. And let me just give you a few more numbers. Again, if we look at this process, to make a drug, to get a drug approved, there's huge attrition. So you actually have to start with 24 targets, 24 projects are initiated, trying to make drugs against them. That yields, on average, for the industry, about 9 drug candidates that make it into clinical trials. But of those 9, only a single one will make it over the finish line as an approved drug. It takes about 13 years, on average, from this point to that point, 5 years to make the drug candidate, 8 years to get it through the clinic, for a total cost, including the failures, of about $2 to $4 billion. So the companies that do this are already struggling to succeed just at this. There are no more resources to fund the ferment back here that leads to the identification of new knowledge that can then be built upon. The companies can't do it, and they won't do it. And so, in fact, it's NIH-funded discoveries that lead to this. So the ecosystem requires this kind of investment at this stage. Now, I called it an investment rather than a spend because, in fact, it is an investment with a huge return. So yes, it costs money, but I'd like to spend the next few minutes outlining what the economic benefits are that flow from that investment. And the first is in terms of improved health. From the reduction in deaths from cardiovascular disease that I showed you on one of the earlier slides, it's estimated that the savings to the nation exceed $1 trillion a year, both in reduced healthcare costs and in increased economic benefits, increased economic activity of the people who are spared. Here are some other examples that for cancer patients, we have estimated value of over $1 trillion. Same thing for drugs for HIV/AIDS. And let me just illustrate the importance of this by focusing again on Alzheimer's disease. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's estimated that by 2050, there'll be 13 million people with Alzheimer's disease in this country. And the cost of care, and this is just for nursing care, where money changes hands, would be projected to reach about $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion a year. Now, if we had a hypothetical drug that does not exist today that could delay the disease by 5 years, more of these people would die of natural causes, undemented, rather than Alzheimer's disease. And the savings, both, first of all, the savings in terms of quality of life would be immense for them and their loved ones. But also the economic savings would be sizable. It's estimated about $450 billion per year. That's $1 billion per year in today's dollars. Now, contrast that with our investment in the NIH, which is $30 billion a year. In fact, this slide just illustrates a remarkable discrepancy between the investment in NIH, shown by these blue bars, and the cost of care for the major diseases, shown by the red bars, with all the diseases outlined here. In fact, as I think you know, the total cost of healthcare in the US is about $8,000 per citizen per year. NIH funding is 1/80th of that, $100 per citizen per year, just pennies on the dollar, in spite of the huge economic returns that we can get from reducing the burden of disease, not to mention, of course, the benefits to the patients and their families. It isn't just benefits in terms of improved health care. There are also direct, tangible economic benefits. It's estimated that every dollar of NIH funding generates over $2 in local economic growth, with hundreds of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars of new economic activity generated by that. Also, it stimulates massive R&D spending. It's estimated that $1 in public investment in basic research will lead to many-fold more private R&D over time. And just to illustrate this, I just want to show you what the investment of industry is in biomedical R&D. You can see it's about twice or over twice what we spend on the NIH. This money is spent in the US, and it's spent in the US because of the vibrancy of our basic biomedical research sector. If we did not have that sector, that money would not be spent in this country. Moreover, it's not just the direct spend that matters. It's estimated that for every job that's generated in the biopharmaceutical industry, it supports an additional 4 jobs in other sectors. So the close to 1 million jobs in the biopharmaceutical sector yield almost 3.5 million jobs total. So great economic gains as well. Just a few more points about the biopharmaceutical sector. First, it's the most R&D intensive in the US, so more is spent per employee than in any other sector, as you can see here. And moreover, the biopharmaceutical industry is the biggest employer of R&D talent compared to other manufacturing industries. We hear a lot about the semiconductor and auto or aerospace industries, but actually biopharmaceuticals account for more manufacturing R&D workers than any of these other sectors, as you can see here. The net result of this is that the US is the leader in the development of new therapeutics. About half of all new drugs are discovered in the US currently, here you see, compared to all other drug-producing nations. So great benefits for our health and necessary benefits for our health, and great return on the investment in terms of improved health, improved productivity, and direct employment and economic benefits. But is our investment sufficient to sustain these health and economic gains? And again, to echo what the Congresswoman said at the beginning, what we've witnessed over the past decade is a worrying decrease in the level of NIH funding. This is NIH funding in current dollars and nominal dollars. Here, adjusted for inflation, you see that spend peaked around 2003 and has been decreasing. In fact, it's lost about 25% of its purchasing power over the last decade. The net result of this is the financial squeeze has triggered a crisis in the biomedical research enterprise. You can see this graph shows grant success rates decreasing over the years from the 70s to today, so that our scientists, and this is true at Rockefeller, it's true at other universities, all other universities around the country, are spending more and more time raising money than doing the research that they trained for all those years. In fact, many of them spend more time raising money than actually doing the research, which is just a huge waste of the investment in these individuals. Even as bad as that is for research today, what's even more worrying is the effect on the younger generation, because younger scientists are seeing how difficult it is to actually have a career in science. They're excited to get into science. When our graduate students arrive at Rockefeller University in the first year, they all want to have a career in science. But then they see their mentors struggling and spending, as I said, more time raising money than doing the science. While many of them will stay in research, thankfully, many more of them today than even a decade ago will decide to leave and go for other careers. So there's an erosion of the base, and that's what worries me the most over the long term, over the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, that will erode the base of scientists. This is true also for the foreign talent that comes here, people who come with PhDs to get postdoctoral training, and the very best of them over the past many decades opted to stay in the States to do their work. I'm an immigrant myself. I'm Canadian. I was trained in Europe, and I came here for postdoctoral work. And back in the early 90s, when I started my career at UCSF, it was really a no-brainer to stay in the States. Today, people in my situation look at it and see that the opportunities elsewhere are as great, in some cases greater, and there are fewer struggles for money, and many of them are choosing to depart. And indeed, if you ask, well, couldn't we just rely on other nations to generate the basic knowledge? And then industry here could continue to do the translational work, but that's not how it works. Industry wants its R&D sites to be located next to the sites of innovation. It's as simple as that. Over the past 30 years, there's been a massive transfer of the industry from Europe to the United States because the US biomedical enterprise has been the most vibrant. If we don't sustain our investment in our basic biomedical enterprise, industry will pick up and move to the other sites of innovation. And where will they go? Again, here you see the countries that are investing, with China leading the pack in terms of the growth of the biomedical R&D expenditures. So that is really the threat that not only will we erode our basic research base, but we'll see a further erosion of the pharmaceutical base as well, with a loss of all the economic benefits and all the jobs. So what do we need to do if we're to sustain our medical gains as well as our economic gains? Well, first, of course, and I think the message is clear, that we need to arrest and reverse the decline in the NIH budget. And in fact, a reasonable aim would be to grow it back to its 2003 level in absolute dollars. To do so in part by relieving the squeeze on existing programs so that our scientists can spend more time doing science than raising money. But also, it's an opportunity for making strategic investments in areas that are breaking open. And here, again, as you know, the proposal has been, in the last 2 weeks, to focus on the brain in particular because of the need, because of the opportunity that's made available by these new technologies. The investment that's been requested is $4.5 billion over 12 years. As my colleague at Rockefeller University, Cornelia Bargmann, who co-chaired the Brain Initiative Committee, said it amounts to about 1 six-pack of beer for every American over the entire 12 years of the program, 1 can of beer every 2 years. So again, just to the scale of it, a very focal investment with potentially huge rewards in terms of improved mental health. Of course, it isn't just the government that needs to do work. The rest of us, the other stakeholders, have to as well. The academic sector and the NIH has to ensure that the funds are spent as effectively as possible, and also focus on ensuring a pipeline of young talent, of young scientists who can renew the base. And collectively, all of the stakeholders in the ecosystem, the academic sector and NIH, the disease foundations, the private sector, both small companies and large companies, we have to work together to ensure the translation of research discoveries into new therapies and cures as effectively as possible. And so let me close then just by showing again this slide that just highlights the discrepancy between what we spend every year in red on disease burden and the investment we make in the NIH to try to reduce that disease burden, and highlight again that renewing NIH funding is an essential investment, not just for our health, but also for our economy. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes?
So thank you for the really interesting presentation. But what impacts do you think increased NIH funding will have on genomics in terms of understanding neurological disorders?
Right, so genomics, it's another one of these very powerful tools, the ability to sequence the genome for close to $1,000 today. I just want to remind you that a little over 10 years ago, it cost $100 million to sequence a single human genome. Now we're down to close to $1,000, just a remarkable rate of progress. It's making it possible to do many more genetic studies, looking at individuals, especially families, in which there are inherited neurological and neuropsychiatric disorders, as well as some that arise spontaneously, and to look for the genetic basis for them. There's been tremendous progress in identifying the molecular basis, the genetic basis of early childhood neurological disorders, for example. Many entry points that have come to light through the study of more prevalent diseases like autism. And it's certainly going to be a key component in identifying what goes wrong in those conditions and providing entry points for new therapeutic avenues. So it's a very exciting time that's made possible just in the last few years by those technological advances. So your question was, what's the impact going to be? The impact is going to be huge, and it's going to be transformative. It's going to help break open the field. I talked about breaking open the field, and that's one of the technological advances that will break open this field, as we've seen happening in cancer.
Do you think our advancing medical knowledge is going to create or find more problems than we are solving on a yearly basis?
Will it create more problems?
I guess find more things that we need to research, and I guess more areas that we can kind of go into that we are solving or finding different drugs that can treat them.
Well, I think what we're going to do is there will be progress in identifying. A lot of the progress will be in taking diseases that we think of as one unified disease and realizing that they aren't just one disease, that they're multiple diseases. So that has become very clear over the last 20 years or more in the case of cancer, where breast cancer isn't breast cancer isn't breast cancer, lung cancer isn't lung cancer isn't lung cancer. There are multiple different kinds of cancers, not an infinite number, not even an enormous number, but a dozen, perhaps a few dozen subtypes, each of which is caused by a different lesion or lesions, and each of which requires a different kind of treatment. So there will be subsetting of disease in that sense. There are also some, so I think that is the kind of new knowledge that we'll see that will, if you will lead to new insights and new diseases. But I don't think that it will increase the burden by doing that. In fact, it will create the conditions for solutions. Many drugs that work in one type of, one subset of cancer won't work in the other subsets of cancer because the molecular basis of the cancers are different, even though outwardly they seem the same. So subsetting is key to getting drugs that work. Some drugs that fail in clinical trials might actually be working in subsets of patients. So that kind of parsing of disease, subsetting of disease, will actually increase success in clinical trials. So I think we'll see more of what you said, but I think that the net overall effect will be a beneficial one.
Yes. I just had a really question about the funding of rare disease work, because probably as you as a biologist can appreciate that it's not where biology is working, it's when it's not working that you learn new things. But yet it seems like there's a lot of, I don't want to say bureaucratic meddling, but everyone's using the word cancer or Alzheimer's, and I understand that. We all know someone has cancer, Alzheimer's. I'm not saying that those are not areas that we should be focusing on, but you could be making more advancement by understanding some disease that only strikes 100 people, but because you discover a new intracellular mechanism or a new, whatever you want to call it, that might be the key that unlocks, greater potential for, let's say, eventual cure for cancer or something about Alzheimer's.
So I think you're absolutely right that many of these rare diseases hold the keys not just to their own disease, but also to understanding that can be leveraged for other diseases as well. So I agree with you on that. But the good news is that, in fact, there is that realization. The NIH certainly is investing in those rare diseases. Industry is as well, thanks to the Orphan Drug Act, which has created the economic incentives for them to enter the rare disease space. So in fact, what you're seeing certainly over the last decade is much more activity in that space, but I agree completely with you that space promises to help unlock knowledge that will be valuable across the board.
But do you think that Congress kind of sometimes hurts the process more by putting more emphasis? Like you look at the recent NDAA bill, and again, nothing wrong with it, but people calling out more work on cancer of pancreatic cancer or colon cancer, which I understand, but I mean, I don't know what the history was with the creation of the NCI. I'm not saying that was a bad thing, but it just seems like there's a lot of meddling that might, otherwise.
Right. So it's certainly the case that you have to have a proper balance. Within any portfolio like the NIH budget, it's fair to ask, year over year, decade over decade, are we placing the bets in the right ways? For example, if you look here, the fact that Alzheimer's disease, the spend is about $500 million a year compared to cancer, which is $5 billion. If you look at the disease burden, might seem a little out of kilter. At the same time, there are huge opportunities in cancer right now. So your point is well taken. I think you have to get down into the details and the specific cases to determine whether it should be, the budget here should be rebalanced in one way or another. And it's certainly part of the responsibility of the NIH and congressional leaders to examine this and make sure that we're allocating the finite resources in the right way. Yes?
So funding seems to be a critical component of actually helping cure these diseases, but I was wondering if you know if there's anything else that Congress could do to actually help this industry help other people.
So funding of the NIH is of the fundamental research, again, because industry can't and won't fund the fundamental research. So that's why the major source of support has to be government in that case. If we want to have this virtuous cycle of knowledge generation, then knowledge translation by industry, with all of the health benefits and economic benefits that flow back and that multiply the investment many times over. So we need that, and that is probably the single most important thing. But beyond that, certainly, as you know, the biopharmaceutical industry is a tough business. You saw the attrition numbers, you saw the investment that's needed, you saw the timelines that are huge. So it's a tough business, and it's especially tough for small companies who try to get off the ground. So creating economic circumstances through various devices such as tax credits and other things in order to enable these companies to make these difficult bets is certainly valuable, and more of that would be desirable if we want to really stimulate the sector. Large companies also have their problems with the long timelines and the big spend. There, I'd say one of the most important things is to make sure that the regulatory apparatus is working in sync. I talked about the 4 stakeholders. The FDA is a key 5th stakeholder in all of this, and has been a very attentive partner, working with industry to try to make sure that the drug discovery enterprise flourishes as much as possible, making sure that the FDA has the resources it needs, but also that the FDA works as a partner to facilitate the development of drugs rather than impede the development of drugs is also a key component of the ecosystem if we want it to remain vibrant and healthy. Yes?
You commented a great deal about the need for investment in the scientific discovery stage. What are your thoughts about NIH investment in drug repositioning?
So certainly, if drugs have already gone through clinical trials and we know a lot about them, it's a great starting point if the opportunity arises. So a drug that targets a particular molecular mechanism might have been developed for one indication, one disease, but knowledge may arise that says, well, wait a minute, the same mechanism is involved in another disease. Let's try repurposing that drug for that other disease. So it certainly is a good way of jump-starting, and you want to get as much value out of the prior investment. It's a great way to get value out of a prior investment. And so I think we're going to see some wins from that, of taking drugs that were developed for one purpose and repositioning them for another. However, that's a component of the overall picture, but it's very clear that we also need to be making drugs against targets that haven't been targeted yet. There's no evidence that any of the drugs that are out there currently developed for other indications will be useful in Alzheimer's disease, for example. And instead, it's the knowledge about what goes wrong in Alzheimer's that's pointing to yet other targets that we have to target with drugs. So you need both, but certainly we should be trying to leverage past investments as much as possible, and that's a good way to do it. Yes.
My question is related to, in particular, when we think about FDA and alternative approval mechanisms that help to shorten or help to facilitate drugs to market faster, can kind of bring down costs and times access. When we're determining things like surrogate endpoints for drug approval, is that going to be developed during the science discovery phase or during the drug discovery phase, or who's kind of informing that decision?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. If we want to facilitate the development of drugs, surrogate endpoints can be valuable, in some cases essential, in order to get drugs to approval, so you can then work with them and over the long term see what the benefits are. The surrogate endpoints typically will arise through, the same set of collaborators, the academic researchers who are focusing on the disease, the companies, the small companies and large companies that equally are focused on developing drugs in those diseases. And the disease foundations themselves. Again, the disease foundations are a key component of this ecosystem. They, of course, are more passionate than anyone about the particular disease that they're focused on. And you can see this, that a lot of the disease foundations out there have been really responsible for enabling a lot of the drug development. If you think about cystic fibrosis, you think about Alzheimer's disease or other indications. So I don't think there's any one group that's responsible. There's certainly, what's happened over the past 20 years also is much more collaboration among all those components of the ecosystem, including the acceptance by all the players of the need for what's called pre-competitive research that will benefit everybody. And the ADNI program at the NIH, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, that was led by the NIH, that brought together industry leaders and academics and disease foundations, is a good example of this. Even before we had drugs to test in Alzheimer's disease, having a better understanding of the disease, better ways of imaging disease progression that could then be used as drugs started to come along, which they have started to come along, has been essential in accelerating the whole drug development process. And that's something where the community came together collaboratively. I think the NIH can play a key catalytic role in enabling that to happen in many more diseases as well, and it has. So it's a shared responsibility, but it's one where the NIH can take the lead. Or gentleman back.
Thank you very much for a very nice presentation on articulation, especially for sustained funding for NIH. You might find some resonance, the same thing happening on the national labs, where much of the basic research is done. What I find that despite the long lead time it takes for the basic research, like NIH, to find its way to a drug development, on the industry side, the industry is not that patient, I guess, when it is looking for research from national labs. So my question to you is, how is that the drug industry is able to develop a closer sort of association with NIH, and why the product industry is not able to develop such alliance with the national labs?
Well, I think it's fair to say that if you look back 20 years, industry and the academic sector did not work together as productively as they could have. But there have been a lot of learnings over the past 2 decades. And just in the past 5 years or so, we've seen many more productive collaborations develop, where industry, first of all, has recognized that it needs to reach earlier into the academic sector, whether it's the national research labs or research universities. And equally, the academics recognize that they need to be partnering with industry if they want to move their discoveries towards the clinic. For this to work, what needs to be set up is the proverbial win-win, where the collaboration gives both parties what they want. For academics, the ability to test their ideas, to move them towards or into the clinic, the ability to do this with academic values respected, the ability to publish and to share the information. For industry, it has to be done in a way that helps them on their mission, which is to move the discoveries towards the clinic and also make new products that they need to sustain themselves. So it can't be skewed towards the academic or too much, or towards the industry too much, which is what tended to happen back in the 90s when people were experimenting with the first types of collaborations. But perhaps after we could discuss, I'd be happy to share with you some of the experiments that are working very successfully now between companies and the academic sector. I think we've learned a lot. I think we're in a much better spot today. There's still more work that can be done. We can still improve the interface. And indeed, that should be a priority for us. But I think we're doing much, much better today than we were in the past. Yeah.
I actually have a similar question that kind of goes in the opposite direction, which is there are certain types of drugs that I think the drug industry doesn't want to touch, whether they're for very rare diseases or, for example, antibiotics, which lose their effectiveness the more that are sold. What kind of role do you see the government playing in doing all the research that previously industry has done in bringing these important but less profitable drugs to market?
Well, first of all, I think you would find that if the incentives are set up right, industry will enter any area where there's a scientific advance and where it thinks it can make a difference. If you say when industry started leaving, not investing as much in psychiatric disease, people said, "Oh, why is that? Are they not interested?" And the answer is absolutely not. Industry would love to be doing more in that space, but there are no insights to build on. Again, no knowledge, no drugs. If there's no insights, you could spend a lot of money, but that would be money down the tubes. And we're all concerned about the productivity of the industry, and one of the things you want is for the industry to be wise about the investments it makes. It doesn't make sense to invest a lot when there is no knowledge and no real opportunity for advancement. So in those areas, let me just take the example of Genentech. The area of antibiotic resistance has, again, opened up in recent years because of our ability, 10 years old now, to sequence the genomes of pathogenic microorganisms. So that suddenly gave a whole new range of targets that could be interrogated, as well as new tools to interrogate the organisms, and led a number of companies to come back in. I was at Genentech when we made the decision to reboot an infectious disease program and to start working on antibiotic-resistant parasites. I think, and for the rare diseases also, they're rare diseases where even if you know the genetic basis, knowing the gene that's defective tells you something about the biology. It doesn't necessarily give you an entry point for making a drug. Sometimes you're lucky and the gene that's affected could itself be a drug target, but not every molecule can be a drug target. If you think about the easiest drug targets are enzymes that might have a little pocket, and you make a chemical that blocks the pocket. There are many genes that are affected in rare diseases that aren't enzymes. They might be very large proteins, and it's not clear from knowing what goes wrong how to make the drug. So what keeps industry away is usually lack of knowledge rather than lack of interest in any one disease area. So as for the NIH itself making drugs, I think that the NIH has a very important role in facilitating the translation of basic knowledge towards therapeutics, investigating the science of translation, which is what the new NCATS Institute is all about, right? It's really the science of translation. How do you take discoveries and move them most effectively? But you saw the spend that it takes to make one drug. The NIH doesn't have the resources to do this. Moreover, there's a cultural difference. The culture of drug development requires an army-like organization, okay, at which, frankly, the NIH is not, or other academic institutions, including my university, are not so skilled. What we're skilled at is instead at getting brilliant individuals to deploy immense creativity around these intractable problems and break them open. And then industry is very good at taking that and marching through, again, with the organization of an army to move them towards the clinic. So I don't want to say that no drugs will be developed in academia or at the NIH. Indeed, some academics are now trying to do that. And there is opportunity in very, very focal areas. But in general, I think this division of labor that we have is one that arises naturally, both because of the economics, but also just as importantly because of the cultural differences between what it takes to be successful in one area and what it takes to be successful in the other area.
Yes. You had a slide up there where you're talking about right now the average age is 43, the first time they get an R01. It seems to be getting, the age seems to be getting older. You also said anecdotally how a lot of students are leaving because of the funding situation. And your presentation makes a pretty good case for the need for increased funding. But at the same time, and maybe the argument you're making is a little bit more, there's maybe more subtlety in what you're asking, but at the same time, the universities, especially medical schools where a lot of this NIH money goes, a lot of these positions that they have are like what they call soft dollar positions, right? So this proliferation of the soft dollar position where there's no skin in the game by the university, it doesn't really cost them that much, to have all these positions. I mean, I guess the point I'm trying, asking you is, don't you think universities also, need to reform and do some things so that, you can, alleviate that specific problem that you're talking about, investigate? Because there's just so many coming in, and the universities don't seem to have any, the minute you lose a grant, that investigator's not going to be around. The point you raise is one that's being actively debated right now in the academic sector about whether universities should have more skin in the game. For my university, actually, our faculty, we pay 100% of the salary. NIH dollars represent about 1/4 of our operating budget. The rest is from endowment and philanthropy, and Howard Hughes and other things. So in fact, the NIH dollars are leveraged fourfold in our institution. But it is true that there are many institutions where there are many more soft money positions like that.
And I think you make a good point, and it's one certainly that I'm very sympathetic to, that having some skin in the game is important. At the same time, I'm not sure it's an easy solution, but it's certainly one that we need to be looking at. Whether that will, what that will do is it will add some sustainability to some institutions. Many institutions, of course, already do have skin in the game in terms of salary support and other support. So it could add stability to some institutions. It wouldn't cure the overall problem of the fact that the need and the opportunity are much greater than what we're investing for right now. And we're doing it at a time when we actually have the scientific talent to deploy those resources effectively. So I agree that falls in the category of making sure that the NIH dollars that we have are spent as effectively as possible. That's something else that we need to focus on as well, as I had on my previous slide. But it doesn't lessen the need actually to revisit the NIH budget, generally given the need and the opportunity. Yeah. Great. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much.